All right. So, welcome everybody again. I'm still buzzing with Niigaan's keynote speech, which was amazing. So, I think what we kind of wanted to do here this afternoon was just maybe start with if people had any questions in regards to the keynote. I know Niigaan's got some other stuff to talk about, but I wanted to give people the opportunity maybe just to raise your hand if you had questions or comments about the keynote.
And also receive an apology from me for not realizing I was supposed to end at 12:30.
Yeah, it was
I was
all
like,
good.
I was just going, and I was like, I got an hour here. I'm laughing, and then boom, I was like, you sent. I saw your message that went, okay,
Oh,
you have 8 minutes, and I was like, oh shit. So, anyways, but I finished at 12:40. So there you go.
awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Oh,
You don't.
thanks, Alexis. You're my new favorite person. So that's lovely. Honestly, it's way better than a situation I had where I thought I had an hour keynote one time, and they were like, they were like, you got 5 minutes. They didn't realize that they gave me 30. Like, who gives 30 for a keynote? Anyways, so way better than I did that time.
All right, Niigaan. Well, maybe I'll. I don't see any hands raised or questions in the chat right now, so maybe turn it over to you, and maybe if you want to pick up where we left off with the keynote.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to drop in a few things here just to add in. So this is actually from a talk that I'm giving with the Manitoba Teacher Society in an hour and a half. And so, but it's related. So, but it's basically what I do is I do kind of, I do workshops all across the country. I guess maybe I should just sort of pin myself here, or what should I do? Or what should, I don't know.
I will
Not sure
unpin myself, I think.
Oh, I think I am pinned. Sorry, I am pinned. Sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to, go back to some important elements here. Like, so I've gotten a lot of like I've gotten in a lot of situations because I keep talking about situations in Manitoba, but it really is indicative of, I think, a trend that's happening because. Don't be fooled. And you are a bunch of social studies teachers, so you are critically minded. But the way that this country operates, and it's quite frustrating for those of us who are out there in the public doing work and so on, is like I'll go on Power and Politics. In fact, I'm on Power and Politics in 3 hours. So, and I'll get the listing of the topics on what we're going to be talking about for today, and they're almost always Ontario. So, we're supposed to be talking about national issues, but we only ever talk about Doug Ford. That seems to be the thing or occasionally Quebec, and usually Bill 21 in some way, or Francis Legault, or whatever. My point of saying it is that it's an interesting thing that's happening in the country right now, and I want you all to notice it as social studies teachers, because it's worth talking about. It's worth, for people in the field, I think you'd find this interesting. When things happen in Toronto, like for instance, the Raptors made a territorial acknowledgement. Of course, the Montreal Canadiens made a territorial acknowledgement the other day. It's like a big deal. Like suddenly the Globe and Mail cares, suddenly the Toronto Star cares. And because they care, suddenly everyone else cares. CBC cares and all this other thing. The fact is that we've been doing territorial acknowledgements since 2015 here in Manitoba at sporting events, but then also previous to that, Vancouver has been doing territorial events even before that, going back until, my undergraduate degree or my graduate degree, which was back in 2006, and even before that. My point of saying is just because something's happening in Toronto and Montreal doesn't mean that it's newsworthy. The fact that there's been things happening in spaces here on the prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Northwestern Ontario, what is the often rap that is told about us? It's that we are the most violent places, racist places, insert whatever ist places in the country. But the fact is that the most racist place in the world are those who don't talk about it or pretend it's not going on, or frankly are so busy marginalizing and refusing to deal with the issue, that the rest of us who are dealing with the issue and are engaging the principles of the issue, particularly around reconciliation. And yes, Toronto and Montreal may be the economic centers of the country. Yes, they may be even the cultural centers of the country. But the fact is they are not the center of reconciliation. The center of reconciliation is the prairies. it is Manitoba, it is Saskatchewan, it is Thunder Bay, and it is parts of Alberta. And these challenges that we are facing, the solutions will come from there. And frankly, BC, there's more innovative things happening in BC and the North, in Yellowknife than we would ever see perhaps even on the prairies here. So it's worth noting that when we have conversations about these things, we cannot be looking for solutions in Toronto. That's the place we normally look for solutions. We look for that to be the economic superpower and so on and so forth. So what does that tell you? That tells you that we are in untreaded territory. We are in unknown spaces. We are in first-time spaces. And it may just be that Indigenous peoples are leading those spaces because they have been unforeseen by Canada in the past, or unwelcomed, or marginalized and erased in the past. It may just be that these things that are happening on the prairies are very remarkable. Now, that being said, I happen to be able to travel to school divisions all across the country, and I'm very, pre-pandemic, of course. But, nowadays I'm working with school divisions. Like in the morning, I work in New Brunswick, in the afternoon, Edmonton, in the evening, Vancouver. What I'm trying to say is that I get privy to a lot of things on projects that are seen on reconciliation throughout the country. And one of the things that I've been able to see, one of the most exciting developments that I've seen throughout the country, is the opportunities for solutions. And these are the solutions that I'm seeing most often happening in terms of reconciliation. Feel free to take a picture of this if you want, or, these are the solutions that I'm seeing throughout the country. Feel free to, pedagogies, inclusion of Indigenous peoples in leadership positions, culturally based curriculums, language, recognition of traditional knowledge, specificity, including gender, sexuality, clans, and funding, and transition to work supports. I'm seeing a remarkable amount of reconciliation projects on the prairies that are remarkable events that are happening through that. Like in North Vancouver, for example, the collaboration projects involving communities placing totem poles in front of every school in North Vancouver School District School Board. Remarkable initiative, right? Here in Winnipeg, some of the stuff I already showed you around my daughter, or some of the stuff that is happening in Saskatchewan involving language, just really remarkable. I could show you videos as well, about really model examples of reconciliation in classrooms. But getting back to this for just a moment, one of the things when I work with schools and when I work with school staff is I'll say to them, okay, it's fine and good you want to do reconciliation, but where is it living now? And 99% of the time it will be living right here in a lesson plan or a unit plan. And that's the whole problem in the first place. The problem is that reconciliation is not a lesson plan. It never will be, because it's based in relationships. It's not about memorizing residential schools. It's not about memorizing the TRC calls to action. It's not about, you'll never get reconciliation doing those things, ever. You know what you're going to get? You're probably going to get a lot of angry students who are vengeful and mad and resentful that they've had to memorize something that they probably are completely unequipped to deal with, meaning that they don't know anything about it in the past, or they know very little. In fact, they're encouraged not to know it, because when they go into the hallways, when they look at the staff and they go, wow, there's no Indigenous peoples in power in this building. They listen to the intercom, they go, oh, there's no Indigenous voices, there's no languages. When they go down the street and they see, oh, there's no Indigenous flags or markers of territory in front of the school, or when they even look to Parliament, do they go, wow, there's no Indigenous peoples in Parliament that represent Indigenous peoples. There are no Indigenous peoples in Parliament in any governmental decision-making positions. There are Indigenous peoples in Canadian political parties, but we know, anyone who in politics knows, that doesn't mean you advocate for Indigenous peoples at all. And if you want an example, look at Jody Wilson-Raybould. Perfect example. You cannot in any way move a party, a Canadian political party who is voted in by Canadian voters, towards Indigenous peoples. You can get maybe a little few things here. Basically, best you ever get, national holiday, territorial acknowledgements. You never will get the return of stolen land. You will never get co-governance. You'll never get recognition of sovereignty. That's what the Supreme Court's for. And which is really unfortunate, because it's very expensive for everybody involved, and Canada keeps having to pay for these egregious injustices. But that being said, so these students, they learn, let's say they learn a lesson plan. You put reconciliation in a lesson plan, you put in a novel, let's say, or you put in, let's study that map that I showed, or let's talk about Indigenous peoples in our territory. And let's even have like a program where we meet with them on Zoom and do some kind of collaborative project, whatever. None of that is reconciliation per se, unless it lives in the hallway. Unless it lives in assessment, languages, learning styles, teaching styles, school attitudes, policies, counseling, community participation. And probably the most important of all, which is that when I was in school, nobody ever told me, like nobody ever said to me, hey, Niigaan, do you know that the only force in your life that matters is the crown? Did you know that stealing Indigenous land is okay? Did you know that the only thing that matters in the world is that the law comes from this woman with the crown in her head in this far off country? Like, no one ever said to me those three things, but yet every day those three things were said to me, when at the end of the day I had to stand up and say, God save this woman. I sing it actually. God save this woman in this far off place. God bless her. May she rule over me forever. And of course, what is that? That's God Save the Queen. And, we may not sing God Save the Queen anymore, but she's still there. Her picture is still on the wall. Her force is still in law. She's still in every presence of every element of the country. For some reason, we still care about the royal family in the country. Yeah, actually, I would say that if you go up north in the PA, Indigenous peoples deeply care about the crown. But they care about it in terms of the context of treaty, not in terms of, they don't care about it in terms of the crown has jurisdiction over our territory. But I'm telling you, what I'm trying to say is that schools are places of relationships. We teach relationships. We don't teach curriculum. Or relationships are the curriculum. And so the sooner that we can understand that, the sooner that we will get to a point in which reconciliation can live in our schools, because it's not going to live in lesson plans. If you work in lesson plans and not in the hallway, you're actually doing it backwards. You're probably teaching students confusing messages that they will reject later because the hallway is 100 times more influential than the classroom. If you ask a student who teaches them the most, it's not you, it's their friends. They'll say, who do you enjoy spending time with the most in school? They're going to say my friends. They're going to say my coach. They're going to say, they're not going to say you. If they do say you, you're lucky, but it's rare. What they're going to say is they're probably going to say that they learn more from their friends, from the culture, from the, the things that are the informal learning than they ever learn in the formal learning. In fact, formal learning is only about 20 to 30% of a student's day. 70% is where reconciliation must be living in order to support the 20 to 30% in the classroom. That's why all of you should be thinking about your hallways doubly than you do your classrooms. Thinking about who you hire, and I know you don't have say in that, but helping to advocate for who you should hire. If you have no Indigenous peoples in power in your building, there's no Indigenous presence at all, there's no Indigenous peoples who have any say or leadership positions, why would the kids ever think Indigenous voices matter? And if you say to yourself, well, I can't hire anybody, well, you have the power of what video goes on in the hallway. You have the power of what resources are in the library. You have the power in what things are read in the classroom, and then perhaps what poster can be up collaborating and supporting your work in the hallway in front of your classroom, or, what meetings you go to, what events you handle, what logos you have for your sports teams, what words go in your intercom, and et cetera, et cetera. So those are just a few things I wanted to add in and support you in your learning, but also in your advocacy, because I find that if you're anything like the social studies teachers that I know, you tend to be the most politically engaged, active. You tend to be the most socially aware, and you also tend to be some of the most revolutionary people within a school. So I really appreciate that you're all here and spending a little bit more time with me. So.
Niigaan, we do have one question in the chat. I'm wondering if we could just take a look at that. And it is from Leanne, I think. How do we address the nationalist rhetoric that still permeates in the universities? She's thinking about the professors who signed the letter against the CHA.
I actually lost friendships over this, and because of this, like. Well, okay, here's the problem with that letter. The real challenge with that letter. Maybe I'll close this off here so that you can like, most of the people who signed that letter have spent their entire life profiting off of Indigenous people. They've profited off our trauma. They've profited off of our so-called issues, where the real issues is Canada's violence, really. And they've also profited off of tenured positions in which they've been free to perpetrate ignorance and racism. And it's like, just how non-self-aware can you be to then therefore write a letter to say that Canada didn't perpetrate genocide, even though Indigenous peoples themselves. So like, what are you going to cherry pick what Indigenous people say? So these so-called historians are frankly jokes in their field. Most of them are, by the way, totally irrelevant and archaic, and so late in their career that they're like just mind-numbingly out of touch. But what I would say is that, like, how that kind of 1970s mentality of academia, which is that I'm going to use Indigenous peoples like we do with mines. I'm going to go into their community. I'm going to steal their stories. I'm going to take their knowledge. I'm going to take the drums, steal the drums. I'm going to put them in. I'm going to get tenure as a result of all that theft and crime, frankly. And then what I'm going to do is then I'm going to say that none of that was genocide. Like, can we all realize like how hypocritical that is? And the fact that anybody even listened to them is remarkable. Like the fact that we're listening to those who have benefited directly from the violence that they are now defending is worth us all thinking about, and thinking about what we're doing. Like, because we can't control what others do, but you can control what you do. And giving people like this space. And frankly, one of them is I thought, a very good friend, who has done an entire series of books and research projects on Anishinaabe people. And in fact, he has, in many ways, has been quite ethical. He's done good job to learn the language. But I said to him, like, are you aware that you have profited off exploitation and violence, and you are now defending that exploitation? So, like, it's inexcusable. And what it does is it suggests that those who take this, and this is one thing I'll say here. I find it so exciting when change happens, and when those who have benefited the most from violence are are turning to violence to protect the violence. It is a sign of change. I think that's the most hopeful thing of all. The most hopeful thing is that when those who are deeply uncomfortable are expressing their discomfort, I am most comforted. That's my dad's technique, by the way. He just keeps saying words until they somehow make sense. So there you go.
Excellent. Thanks, Niigaan. There is somebody just named Teacher that said, hi, Niigaan. I'm not sure if that teacher had a question.
Well, hi, Teacher. That was sometimes what I would call the substitute teacher. Hi, Teacher.
Here we go. Maybe just before we get to that question, Aaron is asking, can you just say what you just said again?
I said basically that those who wrote that letter need to sit down. And they need to just listen a little bit. And frankly, on your way out the door, you don't need to be closing the doors for others. Because frankly, when I saw the list of who's on that letter, I was like, geez, I didn't even know that person's still alive. I was like, oh, that person has benefited incredibly on the backs of Indigenous peoples. And they should be a little bit more thankful, or maybe listen to us a little bit. Because I don't know one Indigenous person, other than people who are, have dubious connections to Indigenous communities, who are willing to say that what Canada has done is not genocide. Like, you just look at the criteria. Just look at C, the removal of children from one group to another, period. Or the whole issue is around mental intent, right? Like, that's the debate. The debate is, did Canada have a mental intent? Because they certainly had a physical intent of eradication. But the unmarked graves, the fact that this was a cover-up, that they let graves be disappeared, like at the very least, when the graves became unmarked, Meaning, like the Catholic Church is trying to rewrite history here and say, oh, well, we meant to put the headstones up, but we never did. We didn't have money or whatever. It's like, well, you certainly didn't have money to pay the TRC either. But anyways, or build multi-million-dollar churches in Saskatchewan. But anyways, so if the Catholic Church wants to make that argument to say, oh, well, we meant to do it, but you still didn't do it. So that tells me that that's called a cover up. If you wanted to do it, then you would have done it. And so, yes, like that's a mental intent. If somebody says I didn't do it or I didn't mean to do it, but I still did it, then we're in the position of, is there mental intent? Willingly not doing it shows mental intent. It shows that there is a cover up going on. And so there it is. That's the end of the genocide debate. It is genocide, period. Physical intent and mental intent is present. Okay, thanks. Sorry, that was a long question. So.
No, that was great. Thank you. The anonymous teacher did post the question here. It's a question about beginning a dialogue about the Indigenous experience as a non-Indigenous person. Many non-Indigenous people have a fear of beginning the conversation in a classroom. Question mark.
Oh, for sure. And your fear is legitimate. And, I was scared too to talk about Jewish things, because guess what I did on day one? I screwed up. I said something wrong. Students corrected me. I had to be in this position of going, wow, I'm not the be all end all. And I'm not like how I used to think of my grade 5, grade 7, grade 10 teachers, which is they knew everything. That's the world of postmodernity, which is that we all are learning from one another. Students have important things to say. And most importantly is that there are gaps in our education. I don't care who you are. There are gaps. We don't know everything. So if you begin with that position, and you say that doesn't make me weak, that makes me a better educator to be curious. As Ted Lasso says, if you watch the Ted Lasso series, be curious, right? Or Walt Whitman says that, be curious, not judgmental. And so when you're curious, you say, okay, well, what is it that I need to know? How is it that I can learn? Certainly I'm going to teach something different tomorrow than I will today. You take the risk of making mistakes or showing your humanity. Students, I find, in my opinion, like humanity. They like seeing that you are learning. At the same time, we live in a hypersensitive world where there is a lot of call-out culture. So you got to be ready for that as well. And the fact is, you are in a power position. It doesn't make you a bad person to make a mistake. Sometimes I think when people call out others, it's because of other issues in the relationship. And so that means you have to work extra hard to say, I know I'm going to make mistakes. That means I have to work extra hard in relationships with students. And yeah, that student who looks different, thinks different than me, maybe acts differently than I want them to act. I'm going to have to work extra hard and be extra patient. And that's hard, man. It's not easy. I know. I mean, you're talking to the guy that used to, I taught very privileged non-Indigenous kids, and they asked me to do all of the cultural education for everybody in the school. Like, oh my God, the stuff I had to deal with. Now, here's what I would say. If you do nothing, if you're scared, I get it. But if you do nothing, if you're paralyzed, then you will have succeeded where residential schools failed. What I mean by that is the purpose of residential schools was to erase us from everything in the classroom, everything in the school, everything in education as a whole, to make sure that we never spoke our languages, talked about our culture and history, and particularly did never refer to ourselves as Indigenous people. And to never have that conversation means that you are fulfilling what residential schools tried to do. And that doesn't mean you're a bad person. Let me say that again. You're not a bad person. That just means you're a human person. But part of being a human and partly of being a teacher is that you must be courageous. You must be brave. You're just standing up in front of kids anytime. Courageous. So if you're courageous there, you can be courageous in this. I believe in you. There is nobody I believe more in than teachers. Teachers are the currency of teaching is hope. The only thing that you live off of is hope. Because you believe this world can be a better place. Because you're standing, why would you stand in front of a bunch of kids otherwise? And let me tell you, it's not for pay. It's not your pay that you're getting rewarded for. I know, because I was there once. I was like, oh my God, why is my pay gone before I even get paid? So anyways, so you live on hope. Be hopeful. Be curious. And know that you are not alone. I will stand with you. And people on this call will stand with you every day of the week. And when you make a mistake, Just own it. Say, I'll be better next time, or I'll try, or I never meant to. And if people don't accept that, realize that it's not really about you. It's probably about the people, the 10 other people that have said those things that have sparked or triggered, or like, no, it's not really about you. Your job is to try to figure out ways that when you do make a mistake, like all mistakes that we made, we all got to live together the next day. So what's that going to look like?
Paulo Freire said, washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral.
Well, I don't think with teaching there's no neutrality, right? So,
yep.
Like that's the thing, is that teaching is inherently political, because you have this like crazy idea that kids are good, or they're beautiful. Like the thing I sometimes remind teachers of is like, the whole purpose of teaching is, the number one principle is that everyone has potential. And our job is to give opportunity, right? That's what our job is. So the more opportunity that we give, the more potential is fostered.
So questions are coming in here fast and furious, Niigaan. So I'll try to go back so I don't miss any. One question from Alan. He's asking, what do you think of Harold Johnson's memoir, Peace and Good Order and the Role of the Justice System? I'm not sure.
Harold's a good friend. I love anything Harold writes. I wasn't, I didn't, like, I was actually with him when he wrote the book on alcohol. And I take a bit of a different approach than he does, but I certainly understand his approach to alcohol. I haven't read as much his new book on justice, but he's a lawyer and he knows his stuff. And Harold is a very generous and kind person. So I have trust that it's a great book. So.
Yeah, it was really interesting because he's talking about the case for Indigenous justice in Canada, because he was a lawyer and then he was a Crown prosecutor in northern Saskatchewan. And so he talks about this tension, because many of the people who appeared in the court were people of Indigenous backgrounds. And here he was a prosecutor. And so looking back on that experience, he's talking about we need to change the system and bring in a more Indigenous justice approach.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really good book for teachers of law and politics and history in Canada too.
Thanks.
When
Alan.
I was a kid, my dad was the only Indigenous person other than the accused in a classroom, in a courtroom. And, so I know that experience. And what I can tell you is that, change to the system, change to a system based on racist principles is very slow, which is why the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry simply just said that we have to abandon certain elements of the system. We have to remake the fundamental principles of Canada, which is notions of terra nullius, for example, or notions that Indigenous rights don't exist. Like, because those are the principles of the Canadian political landscape and legal landscape, we will just simply never get reconciliation in the current system. That's why the really only option is to, in many ways, blow up and start again. What does that look like? Well, the implementation of the United Nations Declaration will be heading in that direction, because you can't implement Indigenous rights in a system where Indigenous rights are unrecognizable.
Okay, just continuing on here, we've got a bunch, Niigaan. So Melanie Dubois says, I work at a high school in Manitoba with a small to medium Indigenous population. How do I help empower these students within a climate that has little to no Indigenous representation? More specifically, promoting and recruiting for initiatives such as Indigenous youth leadership programs.
Well, I would just say relationships. I just happen to come from the Manitoba's Interlake, where there is much significant populations, upwards in 40% in some of the schools. But then I also travel to southern Manitoba, where it's probably closer to 5 to 7% of the student population. So I say the same thing to both schools. I say relationships is how it's going to be built. That means that how the students trust you and understand you. And that doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it's a lifelong journey. So what I say to teachers is, it's your job. It's not your job to go to communities and deal with colonialism, to go and help parents understand they should trust you. Frankly, why would any parent trust you? There's no reason to trust you. Zero. I don't care how nice you are. The fact is you represent the residential school system in so many different ways. You don't mean to, but that's your inheritance. It's not your fault, but it's your inheritance. So that means that if you know that that's the reality of you as a teacher, that means that a student won't trust you, a parent won't trust you, a community won't trust you. So you say to yourself, okay, well, I can either just pretend that's not happening and continue the same crappy cycle that I've always been in this school, meaning that we expect parents to come into a building that frankly ostracizes, triggers them. We expect children to come and feel welcome in a place where there's no Indigenous presence at all. Like one of the funniest things is I was in this school one time where they couldn't understand why all the students weren't supporting Terry Fox. They were like, Terry Fox is great. What's wrong? And I'm like, why would any Native kid support Terry Fox? Like, Terry Fox is a great guy. Don't get me wrong. We should be supporting cancer support, but like, how distant are you expecting these students to know to be from their own communities? Like, why would they ever celebrate anyone where everybody outside their community has been terrible to them or abandoned them? If you're on a First Nations and you see the way schools operate, and the fact that, teachers come in and out when they want, and they're generally not that invested in the community other than local people and occasionally a few teachers who stay there long term. But like, no surprise, and never mind the fact that, everything outside of a First Nations tends to be exploitative to that First Nation. Like, why would you ever support Terry Fox? Like, it seems to me that's an uphill battle that you're going to have to work for a very long period of time. So my point of saying it is that work with the community, go to the community, don't expect the community to come to you. When you only teach Terry Fox, and it's not that you shouldn't, as I said before, really valuable, but it's that you are expecting the community to come to you. You're expecting the community to somehow get over the historical injustices, which they have no reason to somehow trust you, to trust the institution, to believe that somehow this is going to be different. How do you change that? Things on the walls, things on the intercoms, long-term commitment, feasting, offering of territorial acknowledgements and ceremonies, offering your power, sharing your power with Indigenous parents in decision-making, all the stuff that I put on that chart just a few minutes ago.
Okay, a couple more questions here, Niigaan. We got, I think, another 11 minutes. And Tara had a question, and I'm wondering maybe if Tara wouldn't mind just clarifying. She's saying that her school community is taking the first steps, but she's looking for advice for next steps on their reconciliation.
Okay, well, I just named off about 15 things you could do. And then I can also, go ahead.
Oh, I did not mean to interrupt. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, yeah.
Where I'm coming from is I'm very privileged to be in a school community that is very committed to this work, and where we're doing and have started the work to do a lot of the things that you've named off, but we want to go further. We want to do more. And so I think that's where, for me, in my learning and being a part of that learning in our community, is where do we go from there to take it beyond?
So I could give you a list of 100 things to do, right? Some of them you'll go, that's great. Some of them you'll go, nah, it doesn't really work for us. And so I've already written curriculums on this. I've given hundreds of ideas. I have a curriculum with 360 ideas. Pamela Toulouse has a great book called Reconciliation in the Classroom. There's like 200 ideas in that book. That's not the point. It's not about the actions. It's about going, okay, so we've done this. Let's reflect on the successes and then build on those successes so that we have long-term success. So the biggest challenge I find to reconciliation initiatives in schools is that they're so teacher driven, and they also run in cycles so that they only last for short periods of time. And they only produce, because schools only produce short-term outcomes, because that's the way schools are built. They're on one-year cycles. There's little to no consideration of long-term change. But when you add up short-term successes, you get long-term change. So Like if you said, okay, we're going to do the same things for 5 years, we're going to add one thing every year. We're going to do it really damn well, right? And so then you'll get what you get with Maples or with Seven Oaks School Division, for example. There was years ago when Rebecca Chartrand was just trying her butt off to have a powwow, a graduation powwow for the students. Or when I was at Kelvin High School and I did one day of bringing in a couple of my friends to teach traditional dancing to the students. That has now turned into a month of activities at Kelvin, an Indigenous advisory group, a coterie of Indigenous teachers at Kelvin. In Seven Oaks, that little powwow has turned into the biggest powwow, graduation powwow in Manitoba, where they have they use that big soccer center on in Seven Oaks there, that massive, huge complex when there isn't a pandemic, of course. And then multiple Indigenous education initiatives. They just flew in Pam Palmater 2 weeks ago. And, she came in and did a workshop from Toronto. I've done hundreds of workshops for Seven Oaks. Like, what I'm trying to say is that those small steps feel small. They may feel like, where do we go from here? Feel exponentially where you're going. Ask the students what you need. You can draw upon the list that I've produced and that Pam Toulouse has produced, and so a few of them that I just named right here. But ultimately, it's not about the action, it's about the relationships. So you say to yourself, okay, so where are the relationships at here? Do we have students in successful positions, leadership positions as a result of this initiative? Do we have Indigenous students who are graduating more, but graduating more in Indigenous ways? Because like I said, I don't give a rat's ass about diplomas. I give a rat's ass about a diploma if it makes a better Indigenous person. Meaning a more responsible, they go back and be a good nephew, they go help their community, they go work. I say the same thing about non-Indigenous peoples too, by the way. I don't care about diplomas unless non-Indigenous peoples are learning to be ethical, responsible people. And if we're creating young people with diplomas that aren't ethical or responsible, that's a failure of schools. Like, they're more racist when they come out of the schools, and frankly, many schools do produce more racist students than non-racist students. So meaning that students that are benefiting from the genocide that has been continuing through, so they're off, becoming MLAs and business leaders and dentists, and they say, oh, I don't need to know anything about the Indian Act. I'm like, you clearly don't know what it means to be a dentist in Manitoba. 1/5 of your clients are Indigenous. Who's going to pay you? If it's First Nations, Indian Health Branch, Métis Federation, only some Métis communities. If you're non-status, you got to go through the provincial coffers. If you're a dentist, you got to be able to recognize why it is that a kid in Pikangikum and a kid in Charleswood have different mouths. And it's called the Indian Act. So do you know who should be the most active at the marches to replace the Indian Act? The dentists. I don't see too many dentists marching in front of the let's replace the Indian Act. So what that tells me is that the initiatives that you have, while feeling small, still need more work to do. And then more steps need to take place. So build on your successes. Little successes make long-term success.
Thanks, Niigaan. We got about 5 minutes to go here. Matt's got a question that I know has been of interest to you, especially lately. Can you explain the importance of treaty acknowledgements, even when there seems to be little to no other action to help Indigenous communities from the same institutions?
Yeah, territorial acknowledgements without any action are just a bunch of nonsense. It's a waste of time. So when I work with organizations, I don't really care if they have a territorial acknowledgement or not. I do care, though, if they do actions necessary to build the relationships that they're talking about. So like walk the talk. What I mean by that is like when you make a territorial acknowledgement, there has to be two statements. One is you see the people you've been historically taught not to see. Two, actions associated with seeing, meaning that you commit to a spirit of reconciliation. You commit to building a better community for all of us. So if you read the statement the Bombers say and the Jets say, I wrote both of them. So when I work with the Bombers, when I work with the Jets, I'm not a full-time employee of the Jets, but I am a full-time employee of the Bombers. It's one of my contracts. Here's what I can tell you. I demand that the Bombers do actions. Here's what they've done this season alone. Flew in 1,000 kids for a game. Indigenized their logo. honored Indigenous leaders and survivors at games, brought in 500 survivors. This game on Saturday, meaning tomorrow, we're having 500 people from Peguis First Nation, and we've also given a bunch of tickets to survivors we couldn't give to the last game. You know, what I'm trying to say is sharing power is where action resides. Having presence in our community, painting Every Child Matters on the field, indigenizing your logo, those things may seem very small, but sharing power, sharing space. Our sports teams are inherently about stealing land, by the way. Football is about stealing land. Hockey is about stealing land. That's what those games are trying to do. When we do something other than stealing land, it's a revolutionary act that gives people a moment to think, to gives people a moment to be curious, to invite more dialogue. And then, you know, we know that culture changes politics. And so we're thinking long game here. If you have a company, however, that isn't sharing power, that's saying things to check a box, and that ultimately are just doing things to, you know, justify their own violence. And I can imagine what companies I'm talking about there. Frankly, I think they're the problem, not the solution. And I think they should be identified as the problem.
I think Erin has an interesting point here to kind of end off on, and that is, she says, so also what you're saying is the small events really need to be cooperation with Indigenous and non-Indigenous students at the heart.
Well, relationships, yeah. Like, I can tell you that, you know, it didn't change the world that the 700 students from Kelvin went and smudged the Assiniboine Residential School. It didn't change the world that the students did a presentation and they were given space, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, to talk about their feelings around reconciliation and residential schools. It didn't change the world that they all wore orange shirts and walked together. But what it did do is it gave all of them a moment where it was safe to do all of those things. And if it's safe here, as my daughter says, you know, when people listen, then they might listen again. They might act again. And then eventually when they learn and they listen, they can speak up. They can stand with us. So I would just say that relationships are the key. And when I say relationships, it means that when people realize that they're all in this together, there's no like jumping out. As I said in the keynote, there's no like, I opt out of this tobacco. Like I've taken the tobacco, therefore I've committed the 100 hours to you, and we will meet together and we will share tobacco again. The whole problem is Selkirk never came back to give us tobacco. And so the fact is that all non-Indigenous peoples have never given that tobacco as a result, and are only now beginning that process of understanding tobacco. And you today, by spending this time with me, and this is a good way to end, I guess, by you spending this time with me, offer that tobacco. By spending time with all the wonderful speakers that you have at this conference, is giving your tobacco, like giving that tiny little bit back. And so you've taken a step. Now you've listened and you learned. Now you must speak up. You must speak up in that classroom. You must enact yourself in that staff room, and you will suffer because people will call you a social justice left-wing nut, because the world is based on anti-Indigenous racism. But every time someone speaks up and stands together, we change that. We change that dialogue, and solidarity creates revolutions.
And on that note, what a perfect way to end. Niigaan, I can't thank you enough again for what you've brought to us today, and how much you've made us think. And wow, just wow. Thank you, Miigwech, and thank all of you for attending the breakout session today.
Well, miigwech to you, Kevin, and for everyone with the Social Studies Teachers Association that's organized this. And I really appreciate that, you've brought me in for this year. I really love, there's nobody I believe in more than teachers. The only people I believe in more are parents. And so, but really for me, you're tied in terms of doing the most important work of this, of always. So big miigwech, everybody. Thank you for your time, and good luck with everything. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Niigaan. Take care.